Welcome again to another episode of Only the Penitent Shall Pass. I'm Kenneth, along with my good friend John.
Hello.
And today's episode is, has the church bought into the cult of Scientism? A little bit of a controversial episode today.
I suppose so. It doesn't seem controversial to me because I don't think we're supposed to buy into any isms.
Any cults, right?
And I don't think people think of you can add an ism to science.
Yeah.
And maybe that's why it'll seem controversial until we maybe explain what we're talking about.
That's right. Well, if you're listening to us on iTunes or Spotify or now on YouTube, wherever you're listening, you could help us out quite a bit if you copy the link, send it to a friend via your phone, or do people use email still? I don't know.
Well, for work mostly, right?
Yeah, for work. Email it to your work friends.
Get one of those old-fashioned chain emails going.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, there we go.
You can post it to one of your social networks too. Has the church bought into the cult of Scientism is today's episode. Today is May the 8th, 2020. We're still full swing into this era of Corona. Most of the country is still under house arrest. Some states have eased the restrictions a little bit. Most states have not. In the Midwest, almost everywhere in the Midwest, it's against the law to visit your friends, to visit your relatives at their house. It's against the law to visit your neighbors at their house. Pretty strange time to be a Christian, as I've said in the first few episodes. We are obviously not obeying the law.
Well, I think there's a gray area, right?
There's a gray area.
Because this is part of Christian ministry, right? Maybe that's not the right word, but
that's right.
This is a religious activity, I think.
This is a religious activity. I was deputized as a chaplain in order for us to make these podcasts. Otherwise, we couldn't be here. So I guess we are obeying the law to a certain degree. But to be quite honest, we've had more than 10 people at my house for prayer, and I think that's been the rule. You can't have more than 10 people at your house.
It seems like here you're not even supposed to have 10.
Yeah, so maybe it's like less than 10. As a Christian, it's inconceivable if people want to come over to my house, and they have, for prayer, for encouragement. I mean, we've gotten quite a few phone calls from a few people that have called us and said that have been really, really down in the dumps, I guess spiritually, and they asked if they could come over, and we're not going to turn them away. If people want to come over and hear the gospel, and I think of the verse in the Bible that says to rejoice with those who rejoice, to weep with those who weep. And so that is, I feel like, my spiritual calling. If someone is sad, I should cry with them. I should listen to them. I should extend my shoulder. And so if the government tells me I can't do that, this would be one area of civil disobedience. I believe in obeying the government to the point where it conflicts with God's word, which is revealed in the Bible and in Christian tradition. And both in church history and in the word, civil disobedience was approved when it came to scenarios like this.
Yeah, well, if the righteous shall live by faith, then Christianity is supposed to be something that touches on every aspect of our lives. So usually that's not a big deal because the government isn't saying, don't live your life. But it seems like it's more or less saying that to every one of its citizens. So I feel like there's so many different gray areas, and you have to really be guided by your conscience and think, okay, well, what does God want me to do in these times, right? But if that is the case, that our whole life is inspired by faith, it's not just about, oh, you can't do this one practice or you can't do that one practice. Like you said, if somebody needs your help, you have to go to them, right? That would be Christian teaching. And the government can't tell you don't go and help people.
Well, they can tell you that, and they have told us that.
Well, sure. Well, legitimately tell you that, right? It's very strange because it seems like this is a very special sort of tyranny because it is trying to affect every little tiny aspect of our life, like down to a T. And I think that ties into the scientism, right? Because it seems like much of the problem with that is it's like, all right, let's use various scientific methods to reshape every aspect of human life. So this is something that should obviously be concerning to Christians and really to everyone. But we as Christians, we don't hear anything about this, right?
Small pockets here and there.
Small pockets, yeah. But I don't know. Maybe we could get into this scientism.
So we're going to. So for the sake of this episode, we're going to pick a point in time. We could pick many different points in time, but we're going to look at America in the post-Civil War. During my graduate studies, a professor of mine, Professor Ramsey, he wrote a great book on the birth of psychology in the post-Civil War era as addressing a particular crisis. And what he spells out, I wish I had brought his book. I don't have his book in front of me, but his name is Gordon Ramsay. I'm sure you can find it online. And his thesis was that the Civil War had a spiritual and psychological impact on America. So many people in America believed in the American experiment, the Constitution, the Founding Fathers, and when the Civil War occurred, it was such a cataclysmic event that it crashed and blew up people's minds to where they thought, where is God? And because they said, well, if God was in the founding of America, how could the Civil War, how could brother versus brother, cousin versus cousin, neighbor versus neighbor be at war with each other in one of the most bloody conflicts in the history of our country? And so Professor Ramsey, his narrative, or his thesis, I should say, was that if psychology, which was born out of the Civil War, William James, who wrote the Principles of Psychology, who's considered the father of psychology, was instrumental in those post-Civil War years as coming up with a solution to address all of the depression, the loneliness, and what was identified as psychosomatic disorders in the 1880s, 1890s, and early 1900s. So prior to the Civil War, generally people looked to religion. In the Christian vein, they looked to the church when they were spiritually depressed, when they were lonely, when they were sad. And it was the church that would offer solace to these people and offer them answers and give them meaning. In the post-Civil War era, William James, who was somewhat of a spiritual person, but also was very secular, they dismissed the church as having the answers for depression and loneliness and various psychosomatic disorders, and they came up with secular solutions, right? The secular solutions, as it grew, was counseling. You have Freudian psychoanalysis in the 20th century. You have an assortment of drugs, psychopharmaceuticals, to address all sorts of, there's psychopharmaceuticals for anxiety, for depression, for you name the malady, the psychological malady, there is a drug for it. Mm-hmm. In my master's study, I attained a master's degree in chemical addictions counseling, so I had to study at the graduate level psychopharmaceuticals and their effect on the brain, their effect on behavior, their effect on cognitive function. And I worked as a therapist, running the intern program at a rehab clinic, and I learned quite a bit about this whole new way of looking at depression. Now, what our question today is, has the church bought into the cult of scientism? Is historically, for 2,000 years, leading up to, let's say 1,900 years, leading up to the birth of psychology, the church had a very different answer or solution for people who were depressed or who were lonely or who were sad. St. Augustine tells us the soul is restless until it finds its rest in thee. King David in the Psalms writes, the spirit of heaviness, or what we would say depression, is gone from me, for I've put on a garment of praise. And we could give lots of Bible verses about a spiritual answer to depression and loneliness, as well as we could name many saints, church theologians, church fathers, who also view depression, loneliness, and other what we call psychosomatic disorders as being rooted in the spirit. Now, we're not suggesting that someone who is about to commit suicide or something shouldn't be given some kind of medicine to prevent them from committing suicide. We're not laying down.
We're not medical advisors or something.
We're not offering medical advice. This is a discussion.
Yeah. But I mean, I guess what we're trying to say is there a spiritual remedy to a lot of disorders? Because if you look at the numbers, some people, they have extremely very extreme mental difficulties, right, where they'll literally hallucinate, right? Maybe with things like that, it's a lot harder to say what needs to be done.
That's right.
But almost every person my age that I've ever met struggles with depression at some point in their life.
Yes.
It's very common to hear young people say they've thought about suicide. In fact, I feel like the majority of people that I know my age, right, millennials, have thought about killing themselves. So we're more so, I think, trying to talk about this very large phenomena, right, rather than these extreme cases where, maybe someone thinks they're a bird and they're trying to fly or something. That would probably be a different topic altogether. But when it comes to stuff like depression and bipolar disorder, and then learning disorders, attention deficit disorder, there's this whole range of phenomena that psychology thinks it can posit an answer for. That it can say, oh, I can fix that problem. And I think a lot of your work has been to show very clearly that they haven't come close to fixing that problem, and they usually end up making it worse.
I believe it was my second book that I published, Mere Religion, a number of years ago. I was looking at the numbers, and since the birth of psychology, we haven't seen a decrease in depression and loneliness in the 20th century. It's been quite the opposite. As the church and as secular society has embraced psychology fully, depression and loneliness have skyrocketed. Prior to Corona, the statistics that various agencies were releasing, various studies from colleges were releasing, they were staggering, the number of people depressed and lonely. And now with Corona, with people stuck in their homes, I can only imagine how high the depression and loneliness is.
I keep reading things that say all those original numbers have doubled, right? So
I
don't know how they're getting these statistics, but that seems very likely. Say, oh, it's doubled. Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to think. Well, I mean, this sort of goes back to the problem. It's like, well, people are lonely. Well, they generally don't live in community, but they still see people. They see people at work, they see at school. So when you're alone, that makes you depressed. Well, you can really get the sense of how people used to think and say, like, well, it's part of your human nature to be around other people, to have all these various connections. Your immediate family, your broader family, your friends, and these other different groups. Your human nature longs for those things, right? And when you see those things don't satisfy you totally, then it longs for something higher, right? So even very popular people will often get depressed. I mean, look at Hollywood, right? How many stories of drug addiction do we have come out of Hollywood? Well, these are the most popular, most successful people in the world, right? And that still doesn't satisfy them. And this is what I think Augustine's getting at, is that all our desires lead to some ultimate desire, which is God. And so it makes a lot of sense if your narrative is the case that, yeah, once we start moving away from God very strongly in the 1860s, 70s, 1870s, we're going to see a rise in these things.
Yeah, to me, it's as clear as day that if you're not rooted in a church, if your soul is not right with God, you're not in covenant with God, you're not in a relationship with God through the body of Christ, through taking the communion regularly, through praying with brothers and sisters in the Lord regularly. Well, it would seem to be obvious that, yeah, you're going to struggle with loneliness and depression because your soul is not being satiated, it's not being fulfilled, because only God can ultimately fulfill the soul. Now, this doesn't mean that a Christian isn't going to get depressed. It doesn't mean a Christian's not going to struggle with loneliness. Just because we're a Christian, it doesn't make all of our problems go away. In fact, in many ways, being a Christian increases your struggles.
Yeah.
It's not flippantly that we're told to pick up our cross daily and to bear the heavy burden of being a Christian, because we've been, covered in the blood of Christ, which comes with it attacks from the enemy.
Well, and that's when modern psychology, it just doesn't say, oh, if you're depressed, I'll make you feel okay. It says, no, you should be happy all the time. Or you should be, at least, I don't know, what's another word they use, satisfied or something along those lines.
They use the word happy a lot. And in fact, when you talk to a lot of people, as what I did as a counselor, and when you talk to people just at coffee shops or in everyday conversation, a lot of people use the phrase, I just want to be happy.
I just want to be happy.
You hear this a lot when people break up marriage, boyfriend, dating relationships. Well, they weren't making me happy. I want to be happy. Mm-hmm. And as a Christian, that is honestly a very strange way to think for me, because the Bible doesn't ensure happiness. Now, the Bible does ensure peace.
Yeah.
We can be at peace in all things. We can be joyful in all things. But living the Christian life is actually the narrow road, the difficult road. It doesn't ensure fleshly happiness.
Right. Yeah, and that's and it's such a particular, because philosophers, they've argued for thousands of years what happiness is. The happiness people want nowadays is this very strange feeling of, I don't know, elation, contentment, or something. So I just wonder if psychology, it's trying to sell the thing that it proposes to bring about in the patient, which is to say, oh, we can give you that feeling, if you go through this process of counseling or rehabilitation, or you take these particular drugs, right? And in the Christian life, our main example for how to live is Jesus Christ, who went through the agony in the garden before being crucified.
One of the titles of Christ, Man of Sorrows.
Man of Sorrows, yes, right? So it's not just that he was pierced for our iniquity. It's not just the physical punishment that shows us how to live, but it's also this agony, right? When Christ knew that Lazarus had died, even though he was going to raise him, he still wept, right? So this is part of Christian life, is in some way suffering, right? So we shouldn't. So when you meet Christians and you tell them this, and they look at you like you're funny, it's hard to know how to react, because it's so clear, right? There's a whole book on it, the book of Job, right? Which is just about a man's lamentation from his sufferings, who's lost everything. But Job is righteous, right? And that's what we want as Christians. We hunger and thirst for righteousness. So hopefully everyone that's listening is getting a good idea of why we think scientism is a problem or something. And hopefully they recognize, because their whole life is filled with psychology, even if they've never seen a psychologist. So hopefully they're starting to recognize where we're coming from. Do you think there's any way we could...
The reason my undergrad is in psychology, and then I studied at the master's level, psychopharmaceuticals and counseling, was because I sensed that psychology is at the root of a lot of issues we're dealing with philosophically in our day and age. It doesn't mean that all psychology is bad. I think there's principles of psychology that go back thousands of years.
Sure.
In fact, in my one of my early classes in my undergrad, it was the history of psychology. We started with Aristotle, or Plato and Aristotle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Principles of psychology go back a very long time.
Psychology is just the study of the soul.
The study of the soul.
Suke
the
is
study
the
of
Greek
the mind.
word.
Right.
Yeah, so...
I mean, nowadays they say it's the study of the mind. And behavior.
Right.
But ultimately, initially, it was a lot more than that.
Yeah, and I mean, even... soul can mean a lot. It can just mean your breath, your life. So even ancient materialist philosophers, they would still talk about a soul.
That's right.
So even if you're an atheist and you're listening, you could still think, well, there's a soul. I have a certain life about me.
That's right.
That's different from other lives. Right.
Well, and the bedrock of psychology now, other than maybe a handful of Christian psychologists, a handful of Buddhist or Hindu, maybe a few other psychologists, the vast majority of them don't believe in a soul.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so in my textbooks, at both the undergrad and graduate level, there was no acknowledgement that a soul exists.
No.
Whereas as a Christian, that's a starting point. Because if we don't have a soul, well, why are we Christians?
Right. Yeah. Right. Because a lot of the question is, well, like, what are we?
Who are we as humans?
Yeah, who are we, right? This is a very ancient question. It's not just Christians who ask this question. And I think that's what's disturbing, is because from the West for 2,500, 3,000 years, we have this tradition So yeah, I mean, for 3,000 years in the West, we had this precept that was know thyself, right? And that's addressing mankind, right? So even outside of the Christian context, you still, well, what are humans, right? Is this question. And I think that's part of the problem with modern psychology. Like, yes, they study humans and their behavior and so on and so forth, but they're not looking for, like, okay, what can we add or subtract from any particular man that helps get them closer to their human nature, right? They're trying to basically invent what our nature is, and they're always trying to add things to us, like, well, you just need a particular regimen, you need a particular pill, you need a particular this or that, without having this archetype of what a human being is in their mind, right? So if that's the case, just looking at it from a philosophical point of view, then we as Christians have to stand back and say, oh, wow, well, like, how far are we from God, right? If we haven't even understood, if we're not even asking, well, like, why do I exist, right? What am I as a human, So when you put all these considerations together, it does seem like psychology is something different than what we're told.
Yeah, that's a good question you ask. Like, why do I exist? What is the purpose of my life? Psychology, in many ways, has been used to prop up abortion, right? Because what does psychology say? Psychology tells the woman, this baby is a hindrance to your purpose. Your purpose is to complete college and get a career.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, at the same time that psychology tells the woman this, simultaneously, psychology releases studies that say 9 out of every 10 women don't like their career.
Right.
Now it's so psychology says, oh, you should murder your baby through abortion because your career will fulfill you. But then psychology on the back end does a study that says, oh, the majority of women and men really aren't fulfilled at their careers.
Mm-hmm.
So psychology doesn't have answers for the soul, because we know that a career doesn't fulfill the soul of any human.
Right.
Even though Jesus was a carpenter and Paul was a tent maker and David was a shepherd, all of those are noble careers, right? And in today, there's many noble careers. But we know if you seek to satisfy the achiness in your soul with your career, you're actually not going to be fulfilled. St. Augustine is clear as day on this one. The soul is restless until it finds its rest in Him, in God, in Thee. And so psychology is actually a barrier to the soul. It doesn't have answers for the hopelessness of humanity's soul.
Right. Well, yeah, because you're sort of, there has to be more than just whatever's happening in our day-to-day lives, right? So you look around and you say, well, what is everyone else doing? So in this case, well, everyone, they're going to school and they're getting a career. And it's like, okay, well, obviously there's nothing wrong with this. But if we start to ask the higher questions, like, well, do I have a purpose beyond my career or beyond my work? Or what is the purpose of my body, right? As a human being, it's like, well, maybe a lot of women, they would be much happier if they just have the child or they have children and they focus more on being a mother. And there's many women, millions, who have done this, and that's been their experience.
It's
right?
actually been a huge switch among the millennial generation, is that more millennial women are having children than Generation X and the previous generations.
Mm-hmm.
More millennial women are finding a greater purpose in having children. This isn't to mean every woman is called to be a mother either. I think there's great women of the faith like Amy Carmichael and others who were great missionaries. And actually, Amy Carmichael, who never had any children of her own, the missionary from Ireland, all of the children she adopted called her mama in the
Right.
Indian tongue. And she ended up having dozens of children. She ended up being a mother to many. To I think, I don't know how many orphans there were, 30, 40, 50, 60 orphans that she cared for and more. So,
but psychology, it's not, so like we can have a discussion about to what extent women are meant to be mothers and how many women are meant to be mothers and whether this will contribute to your happiness or detract from it. I don't think, it doesn't seem like the popular scientific community wants to have this discussion. They just want to go with the flow of society. But as Christians, we kind of tend to agree, like, well, it seems like there's a lot of bad things in society. But psychology is continuously propping this up. Like, no, you have to go with that flow. So whatever track you're on, you have to stay on that track,
So in the Bible, depression, sadness, loneliness, they're viewed as specific spiritual problems. Why does the church in the 20th century seem to take a back seat to scientism when it comes to dealing with what the Bible deals as a spiritual problem? The church seems to step back and say, well, let's let psychology, let's let therapists solve these problems. Now, not all. I know Jay Adams, he's done a lot of interesting work. I think he's Baptist, I want to say. I read his book, a couple of his books. He has some interesting ideas with regard to Christian counseling. So there are some Christians who've attempted to bring this back to the church. But on the surface, it seems like the great many denominations and non-denominations have said, well, depression and loneliness, let's let the psychologists handle that. But the Bible says, no, actually the church needs to handle it. So the question is, why has the church taken this back seat?
Yeah, I think I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say why, because it was always, Christian counseling was sort of always a thing.
It was always what pastors, elders, older men, older women. Paul says, let the older women teach the younger women.
Yeah.
Let the older men teach the younger men.
And I mean, this is a letter to Timothy. This is an example of counseling, right?
Absolutely. Paul was counseling Timothy in the letters.
Well, and is it Timothy or Titus where he talks about, like, oh, you need to start drinking wine again, right? Because it's messing with your stomach, right?
Yeah.
So Paul, even to an extent, he was like,
offered a little medical advice.
He offers a little medical advice.
Probably
right?
Luke was hanging out and said, "Hey, I hear
There
Timothy's having some stomach problems. Tell him he shouldn't, be abstaining totally. Have a little bit of wine.
Have a little bit of wine, yeah." So with that being said, maybe if we're asking why, maybe it's because the church at some point felt overwhelmed because of the great number of cases where people feel so hopeless. And I don't know if it was ever any better, is ever any worse, but that there is a problem we all seem to agree on, right? So I mean, maybe that could be one of the reasons, but I think maybe at the heart of it is because people don't realize that the scientific method, if you just want to practice that as like one of the many things you do as a Christian, well, look, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. It yields knowledge, particularly practical knowledge, so we can build things, right? And so we've all benefited from some way. But if I take that method and I turn it into a complete worldview, a complete philosophy, it becomes antithetical to the Christian worldview.
It becomes very cultic.
Right. That's why if you're an Orthodox Christian and you believe in, say, miracles and, say, resurrection of the dead, if you believe in these angels, right, and demons, that the angels and demons have an active presence in the world we live in, just go read the books of the great many of scientists in the last 200 years. They do not think this way. And I think that's because they have their own complete worldview, their own complete philosophy. And so when you take that worldview and try to combine it with Christianity, it's just like taking any other, I'll call it a pagan worldview, and say, oh, let's combine it with Christianity.
I think pagan is a good word because the pagans, especially the Greeks, they worshipped a god. His name was, if I'm pronouncing this correctly, Eclepsius. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. And he was the Greek god who was believed to be the god of medicine. His staff was a serpent. Mm. And the Greeks worshipped him, which is an affront to the creator.
And we can all, hopefully everyone listening, we can all agree that you're not supposed to worship idols.
Yes.
Hopefully, I know
you're not supposed to worship false gods.
In the Roman Church, there's some controversy about this. So
well, let's not go there.
Let's not go there. I was I guess, a PSA where it's like, if you don't think this is wrong, please go reconsider. But go on. Excuse me.
Well, so the Greek god, he was worshipped by the Greeks, Eclepsius, as the god of medicine. I'm reading now off the internet. The rod of Eclepsius is found as a symbol of medical practice today. That's why the World Health Organization has the same serpent around their logo. Mm-hmm. This is not this isn't a conspiracy or anything like that. But this symbol of Eclepsius is rooted in a lot of medicinal history.
Yeah.
This pagan concept of a god that is behind elements of medicine. Not all medicine is bad, but medicine which replaces, here's the key, medicine which replaces the concept of a soul before the face of God, coram Deo, that would be a step away from the bounds of Christianity.
Well, and even that the soul before God, that has to be your starting place.
That's right.
Right. So that's why, if we're going to be moderate, we'll say, okay, yeah, maybe psychology has some insights, just like all sciences have some insights, ancient and modern. But our starting place has to be the soul's relationship to God. And then we can have a discussion about where these other tools of thought come in, right? But until we do that, it seems like we're essentially heading towards this other religion, this modern religion of science,
which we call scientism.
Which we're calling by the term scientism, right? And if you don't think what we're saying is real, just go back and watch Carl Sagan's Cosmos. Everything that is, everything that was, everything that ever will be is the cosmos, says Carl Sagan. If you don't think that's a religious statement, I don't think we agree on what religion is. And I mean, Carl Sagan, he's very clear. He ties in his scientific view of the world to ancient Indian religion. So it's not, this is something many people have talked about, right? So it's not, if this is the first time you're hearing it, we're not coming up with it. This is
so the question I read a moment ago, why does it seem like the church in the 20th century and now the 21st century has taken a back seat to scientism in addressing depression, loneliness, sadness? It seems as though one reason the church has taken a step back is because the church isn't discussing this. Right? I mean, this is the problem, is that outside of our little clique in the Midwest, outside of certain cliques around the country, the church at large doesn't tend to even broach this subject.
Well, and that's sort of a larger thing where it doesn't seem like there's a lot of deeper discussions like this in a lot of churches, right? And to me, this just seems like such a natural part of the Christian life, where it's like, okay, I'm reading my Bible, I'm hearing the Word, I want to talk about this with other people.
That's right.
But then also, I have to go live in the world, so I want to talk about what's going on in the world. And I don't want to become of the world, right? I want to live an authentic Christian witness within the world, right?
I'm indebted very much to Francis Schaeffer, as John knows, in that Francis Schaeffer encouraged and taught Christians should question everything. He said because our faith is so strong in God, being the beginning, the end, the Alpha and the Omega, our faith is so strong that the answer is in God, that no matter what we question, it always will turn back to God. Mm-hmm. So we don't have to be afraid to discuss things. We don't have to be afraid to question things. And when it comes to the subject of psychology and depression and sadness and loneliness, we don't need to be afraid to have this discussion. Now, we don't want to err ourselves and start making affirmations beyond the shadow of a doubt. We're just human. We're just having a conversation. We're not saying all psychology is evil. Every counselor is evil. We're not saying that. We're saying, hey, let's talk about this, and we're asking, shouldn't the church be proclaiming much more loudly that we have the answer for depression? Way more so than psychology has an answer.
Right, because and I think if people hear the message that the church is trying to offer or should offer them, it's that we're not saying we can cure your depression like psychologists are. We're saying the gospel is what I should say. The gospel can make it livable, and it can make it meaningful, where you become part of a long line of Christians who have suffered. You become one with Jesus Christ who suffered, right? And so I think maybe that's why, if you have your hope is that I'm going to be happy, you're probably not, and even if you do become happy, what's the Chinese proverb? May you get everything you desire, right? We all know that a lot of people get what they want and they're still unhappy, right? So I mean,
the problem that we face with with these different maladies, depression, anxiety, loneliness, we're suggesting, hey, let's have a discussion here and say, maybe there's a Christian response to this. Another element of this is other psychosomatic, what psychology calls our disorders. Obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, something that was never identified in the ancient world. And I sit here and I say, well, as a Christian, I can question that, and I can say, is that a disorder? If someone has a personality like that, now if their behavior is causing them harm, if someone's obsessive behavior, they're pulling their hair out, right? They're pulling their eyebrows out. I've seen this before. Clearly, there's a deeper problem there. But just because someone has been diagnosed as autistic or OCD, that doesn't even mean that they are different for a bad reason or something, that they have a disorder. I look at someone like Martin Luther, and anyone who reads a couple biographies of his life, you quickly see, oh wow, if he lived in the 20th century, he would have been diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder. Yet his personality aided him in being one of the great Christians in the faith, regardless of, well, actually, even if you're Roman Catholic now, you would consider him a great man of faith, because was it Pope Benedict or Pope John Paul that took away the anathema and now says he's a great man of the faith? He's
a great man of the faith. There
so even Roman Catholics now acknowledge Luther as a great man. And so what I'm trying to say, probably not very eloquently here, is psychology tends to create this concept of the perfect human. Sounds a lot like what the Greeks did. They come up with this idea. Think of Michelangelo's David, and here's a statue, and say, this is the ideal man. And I believe that's wrong.
Right.
I believe what the Greeks were attempting to do to come up with the perfect human, the perfect man, is centered in a pagan philosophy. Because what we know, that all humanity is fallen, and there's only one perfect man.
Right, and that's what should set our example, maybe. And that's maybe at the core of what our problem is. It's like, well, if psychology has a perfect man, it's just whatever functions best in the here and the now, right? And I don't even know how you determine that. Well, there's a lot of people functioning well. Like, so is it whomever you like the best? Who's ever the most successful? Whoever's the prettiest or something? So as Christians, we're like, no, we're supposed to be conformed to his image and to his likeness. And that's mostly absent from psychology. You can, as a Christian psychologist, try to put it back in, but I don't know how well that works.
What really troubled me, the deeper I got into my psychology studies and then working in the field of psychology, was that it seemed as though the goal of psychology was to change humans that had been diagnosed with disorders through either psychopharmaceuticals or through cognitive behavior therapy or through different psychological processes. And it seemed as though the goal was to change these humans into some kind of humanistic or pagan ideal, into the perfect man. And as a Christian, I'm appalled at that. I'm appalled at arbitrarily saying, this is the ideal person we need to create. Let's make people into this mold. That sounds something like what China is doing in their strange communistic endeavor of social engineering, right?
Right. I mean, I went to public school, and I think tacitly that's sort of the goal, right? And if you look in the history of education, there's been a lot of psychology that's gone into it in the last 100 years. But I couldn't begin to tell you what that human being is supposed to look like. And I think that's part of the problem when Jesus says they are blind guides, where they can't show you the way most of the times because they're not even sure what it is. And everybody who spent a lot of time on a college campus and talked to the psych majors, they'll tell you a lot of them are there because they have problems and they're really trying to figure themselves out. And so in the long, I don't know if it's always been like that in psychology or if that's just something I experienced when I was in school, but in the long run, we're going to have a lot of blind guides who they don't even have that. They don't even know where to begin to say what the ideal person is. All they can just say, well, it's not somebody that washes their hands too much. And it's like, well, we definitely need more than that if we're going to say psychology, if we're going to talk about what the soul is. Because I'm very interested in like, well, what is the soul? This is a good question.
Psychology also doesn't address the concept of sin because psychology rejects the concept of sin. So here we have two major pillars of Christianity. We have a soul, there's this thing called sin, and there's this thing called guilt. Psychology rejects all three. There is no soul, there is no sin, there is no guilt.
Mm-hmm.
And it begins, how do I put this? It begins to become impossible to understand why the church would allow psychology to lead the masses when psychology rejects the soul, they reject the concept of sin, and they reject the concept of guilt. I mean, this is very, very serious. If we're going to allow psychology into our Christian walk, it has to be very carefully, because we're talking about this scientism cult that rejects reality. It rejects reality because we know sin exists in our lives. Psychology says there's no such thing as sin.
Right. It doesn't. What psychology used to say that, well, guilt is some sort of manifestation from our relationship to society,
yes.
Right? So this is Freud,
yes.
Right? And this is, so then we sublimate, right? So then we, because of this guilt, we supplement these desires into all sorts of religious symbols, right? Which is to say that for someone like Freud, the cross is just us trying to deal with our guilt we feel because we want to do things society tells us not to, right? So this is just one. I mean, we could do whole episodes about Freud, James, and all the original psychologists, and maybe we will, and we'll show you the origins of these things. But just that one thought right there. So like it seems like what happened in the history of psychology is with Freud and some of the earlier psychologists, they at least talked about guilt and talked about sin. But the later psychologists sort of drop these concepts out, right? Or they become very negligible.
Right. Well, they've rewritten their whole DSM, right? In the 1950s, if a homosexual person came to a psychologist, they were told they have a disorder that they need to be fixed because that homosexuality is an aberrant behavior. Now in 2000, psychology says the exact opposite. We're not going to get caught up in the discussion of homosexuality right now, but the point is that psychology is changing the playing field all the time. It contradicts itself year after year. When I was studying many years ago for my undergraduate degree, I had psychology that specifically taught that the best environment for a child was a mother and a father. So when I was working in my undergrad, psychology, the psychologists, the professors taught, the best environment is a child as a mom and a dad, so that way it gets both the masculine elements and the feminine elements into their life, and they learn to deal with men and women. They get because men and women have different gifts, right? So you're being nurtured with different gifts from two different people. Now, in 2020, psychology says the exact opposite. Oh no, you don't need a mom and dad. You could have two dads or two moms. You could have three dads. You could have polyamorous. You could have three dads and two moms, 5 couples who are all in a relationship together. in 10 years, psychology has rejected psychology from a decade ago.
Mm-hmm.
So and yet the church is not taking a stand against this, right? And I'm not labeling anything a sin yet. I'm not saying what's a sin or what's not a sin, but I will say we know as Christians, God created us male and female, and we know that historically, what did the church affirm for 2,000 years? Mothers and fathers.
Yes.
Being parents. Right? Divorce, Jesus looked at divorce, single parents, as a great tragedy. He's like, we should avoid that at all costs.
Well, that's, we say take care of the widows and the orphans.
Yeah.
The word orphans translates fatherless.
Right.
Right? So that's really what the Bible's talking about. If a young man or a young woman without a father, that's a really big deal. And it's always been thought to be that way. And psychology stuck with that thought for about 100 years and then sort of silently dropped it. And this, again, it goes back to, it's like, well, whatever's happening in the here or now, psychology is just trying to get you to some happy state. And it's like, well, if we're going to go, let's just go back to William James's philosophy of pragmatism. This doesn't seem like it's working.
No.
It seems every year that goes by, there's more mental disorders, there's more people on the psychosomatic drugs, there's more people that are in total despair. And so if we could at least, at the very least, we can just say, okay, well, the father of psychology in America said if something doesn't work, you have to go back and revise your hypothesis. There's something wrong with it.
But there's the key, is they're not revising the hypothesis. They're just adding to it. They're changing their facts, they're changing their beliefs. Oh, homosexuality is a disorder, now it's not. You need a mom and dad, now you just need 2 moms, 2 dads. They just keep changing things, and yet society is still dysfunctional, it's not getting better, and we're suggesting, well, maybe we need to go back to the beginning and say, maybe the problem is your hypothesis didn't include a soul, your hypothesis didn't include sin, your hypothesis didn't include guilt, finding its origin in the fall, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't have an origin story that includes the Genesis fall of humanity. And so here we sit. Now, one of the reasons I really prefer the more liturgical worship, I've gone to an Anglican church for the better part of a decade. The reason I prefer that is not that it's better or to be preferred. I'm not saying what's the right form of worship. I'm just saying this is what I really enjoy about it, is that each Sunday in the Anglican liturgy, you are reminded of your sin.
Yes.
There are prayers of confession, there's prayers of absolution, but the service is designed around bringing the believer before the face of God, Coram Deo, and acknowledging our sin before God, and then it points you to the glory of God, and that we can worship Him because He's forgiven us. We can worship Him in spirit and in truth, and then the culmination of the liturgy is the communion, where we're reminded that we're washed in the blood and body of Christ. So the whole liturgy, the whole narrative of the Sunday morning worship brings the believer through this process where we're reminded of these eternal truths, almost all of which psychology rejects. And so we're pushing this episode a little bit long, but let's wrap it up with the question: Is there any signs of the church beginning to recognize that psychology has failed the community of believers? I don't know.
I don't see it. I mean, I remember, it's strange how quickly things change in 10 years, because I remember 10 years ago meeting a lot more Christians who were like, yeah, maybe there's a lot of problems with this psychology thing. I remember talking to a lot of Christians who were still like, well, in Scripture, it seems like people are often plagued by demons. And I don't mean exorcism level possessions or something, right? But just in the way C.S. Lewis describes it, where there are demons that are harassing you, that are trying to make your life worse. And I feel like a lot of people, they'll hear this, what I'm saying, and they'll scoff, but this is just what Christians always believe, right? This is just like so fundamental. And again, I'm not saying that, every time anyone has any difficulty, well, they have a demon in their soul that needs to be cast out. But these spiritual realities are very real, and maybe we should talk about them.
It seems as though we're in the middle of this corona issue, and it almost seems as though corona, regardless of the extent of how bad it is or how bad it isn't, whether the numbers have been inflated, whether it's, without getting caught up into those details, it seems as though this is another example of the church taking a back step to the cult of scientism, because the church is not leading the discussion on how to deal with sickness, right? Now, we're letting the doctors tell us what to do.
Mm-hmm.
Now, why? Well, what it seems as though the national prominent religious figures are telling us, at least within Catholicism and Protestantism, is everyone stay in your homes, and whatever the doctors tell us, we need to obey them. Now, that frightens me because doctors are not infallible.
They're fallible human beings.
And just because a doctor says something doesn't mean it's true.
Well, and I mean, here's the thing: if you're following the news, there's a lot of conservative commentators that are starting to question. Well, let's look at these numbers. Is this as bad as the doctors are saying? Let's look at this practice of quarantine. It seems like in places that didn't do a quarantine, there's actually less sickness, less death, and there's good scientific reasons to back that up that deal with herd immunity, right, and so on and so forth. And so these secular conservative commentators, they're questioning the official narrative. But that's my real point, though, is why are there no Christians that will ask the same questions? It seems like the entire church, if the medical community says it's gospel truth, and that's the most disturbing thing.
Right, because for me, I would expect our pastors, ministers, priests, whatever you want to call them, the leaders in the church, using church history, using the Bible and church history as a guide, before the medical people talk, the church should begin teaching us, this is how the church responds to sickness, to plague, because the church has faced it. Mm-hmm. The church has faced this many, many countless times.
Yes.
We don't need new parameters taught to us by doctors who are fallible and who make mistakes, right? We don't.
Right.
We need the church to remind us, well, for 2,000 years, when the plague comes, this is what we do.
Yes.
I want to hear the church do that. And as we've talked in the first few episodes of our podcast, historically, the church does not allow their people to be put under house arrest for 2 to 3 months. That doesn't happen during plagues. We had way worse plagues in the past. Mm-hmm. And this doesn't mean we act with abandon. It doesn't mean we tempt God. But we have a clear response. And for some reason, the church is just taking a back seat to scientism.
Well, yeah, because that's one of the main thing we have to compare this to is the Black Death, the plague, right? And so you'll see online, people are saying, oh, well, Notre Dame closed once. And it's like, well, half the city had died, right? So the few times where the churches did close, they all thought the world was ending. Again, maybe that's how we feel. But you can't really compare what's happening now to the Black Plague. Half the continent had died, right? I mean, it was so serious. And so, but even in this thing that was exponentially worse than what we're going through right now, there were Christians acting, right? There were Christians going out and helping those in need. There were Christians getting together, worshiping, and so on and so forth. And I think that's just further proof that, like, yeah, something has changed in the way the church thinks.
There seems to be a fear or hesitancy, if not a fear, a hesitancy by Christian leaders and Christian laity to say out loud, doctors are fallible, and they're wrong a lot of times. They're not wrong all the time, but they're not right 99% of the time.
Right.
If anyone believes doctors are right 99% of the time, go to the hospital and look how many people die from procedures.
Yeah, from medical malpractice. It's a huge problem. You can ask. I had a doctor tell me that once, and he's a very, very renowned surgeon. And he said, yeah, one of the leading causes of death in America is medical malpractice. And he was very troubled by this, right? But I think, one of the reasons he was able to say that is because he had more going on in his life than just being a doctor. And I think that's... Well, no, please go on.
We come out of the 80s and 90s when the doctors prescribed Ritalin to an entire generation of children. And now you can go to a bookstore. Well, they're not open right now, but you could go online. There is a plethora of books by even non-Christians that talk about the Ritalin crisis of the 1980s and 90s as being one of the worst things medicine ever did to humans.
And yet they still prescribe these drugs.
Yet they still prescribe Ritalin at an exponential rate, even though we know that by their own studies that Ritalin had really, really bad consequences, not necessarily to everyone, but to millions.
Oh, I mean, we could talk about Xanax, which is a drug that relieves your anxiety, but is also a drug you have to take the rest of your life, because if you stop, you could have a seizure and die. This is very serious. It's not... Most of the street drugs, if you stop taking it and go through withdrawals, you'll survive. Xanax has this very, very high death rate. I mean, we could do whole...
And we're not suggesting if you're on Xanax, if you're on Ritalin, if you're on a psychopharmaceutical, we're not suggesting you need to stop taking that today. We would never do that. Go...
Well, especially if you're on Xanax, because you could literally die. But my point is, should we trust these men who put you on it in the first place?
We're saying, we're not giving an emphatic answer one way or the other. We're saying we need to question this. We need to question these people who've had negative effects on society, who through the 80s and 90s prescribed millions of people to be on drugs, that now, with hindsight, we see, wow, this had devastating consequences. Mm-hmm. Secularists have written books and have published studies that said what the medical community did, what men and women doctors did to children, to young adults, is nothing short of criminal in many instances. And the church cannot blanketly say whatever the doctors tell us we need to do. Mm-hmm. We have to question them.
Right,
we have to use reason, and we have to question them. Mm-hmm. The cult of scientism begins like every other pagan cult, where you can't question the priest.
And you put your trust in it.
And you put your trust in the priest.
And that was really what I'm saying is you shouldn't really just blindly trust anybody but God. And even in the case of God, our faith just isn't merely blind. We have good reason for believing what we do. So when I meet people, many, many people, that blindly trust everything a doctor says, that makes me think of the more extreme forms of all religions, right? Of Christianity, of Islam, where it's like, I don't even have to think about my religion. I just believe it. And of course that's good, but no, you're supposed to think. You're supposed to use your mind that God gave you and try to come to an understanding. And we're just saying, let's do that in medicine. Let's do that with psychology. Let's do that in politics and in everything, really.
Yeah, anytime someone says, well, we need to trust this person because they're an authority, I start to get a little bit, my eye starts to twitch. My eyebrow starts to twitch. I'm like, well, there is no authority but God ultimately. Everyone else is just man. Everyone else is imperfect.
Yeah, well, the two examples we gave, so the Ritalin, the Xanax, and we could add more. We could talk about electroshock therapy, because we very easily forget for decades they would electrocute people to try to cure them. So think about that for a minute. They would electrocute people to try to cure them, right? So if time after time this almighty authority finds itself, questionable, then we should question them. Right?
I think it's easy as us not being the pastors of churches or bishops or, the head of a denomination. It's easy for us to question these things.
Sure.
Because we don't have a flock of 10,000, 100,000 underneath us.
Mm-hmm.
When you're a pastor, when you're the head of a denomination, when you're in a position of authority, a lot of people under you are on psychopharmaceuticals. According to psychological studies, 7 out of 10 people in America, 70% of all Americans, take a minimum of 1 drug a day. And I believe it's 33% of all Americans take 5 or more different drugs a day.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're a leader, you're walking an even more narrow line than you and I are. We don't want to give people medical advice. We're not doing that. We're just asking questions. But when you're the leader of a church, 70% of your congregation is on drugs,
mm-hmm.
and they're taking them every day.
Yeah.
So you don't want to, say the wrong thing because it could have disastrous consequences, right?
Well, but I think that's where the trouble lies, where it's like, yeah, it does seem when people get off these drugs, and this is why definitely never just stop taking the drug. Like never
If you're on
that.
a pharmaceutical, don't just stop
Don't
taking
just
it
stop
today.
taking it. Yeah, don't do it.
It can have disastrous consequences.
And this is coming from two people who, like we've been saying, we question the use of these drugs. Don't stop taking them, because that does something to your mind that could have disastrous consequences, right? So I think that's what Kenny's referring to. If a pastor just gets up in front of his congregation and preaches against these things, people could die.
That's right.
But with that being said, I feel like that itself is a proof that there's a big problem, that you have to live your life by taking a pill. And if for any reason you ever want to live your life without taking the pill, that's very dangerous, right? And so, yeah, I think Kenny's saying is a good point, but I think on the other hand, that doesn't mean you can just throw your hands in the air and say, well, it's not my problem then, or something, which I think is what, I don't know, it seems like that's a lot of what goes on in America, right? Where, well, it ain't me, so no sweat off my back, right?
But since we believe that the church is given for people, for the whole of a person,
mm-hmm.
the church isn't just for your soul, right? Because we're commanded by Christ, if someone's hungry, we have to feed them.
Mm-hmm.
If someone's naked, we need to give them clothes.
Mm-hmm.
We're supposed to address the whole body of a person, materially, physically, spiritually, emotionally, right? Weep with those who weep. Rejoice with those who rejoice. The Bible and church history is an example that the church is given to humanity to cover the whole of a person. It was the church that started hospitals.
Right.
It's a great tragedy that the church in many ways has stepped back from running the hospitals. I believe the church should be the hospitals.
Well, and then we see, again, this is another area where for most of my life we've been arguing about health insurance and who should get it, how much it should cost, should the government provide it. And then, yeah, we look at the cost of medical services. We're like, this is astonishing how much it costs. Well, geez, is it any wonder that as soon as the church starts to step back and the secular world takes over this very Christian practice, that, well, now we don't know how to do it anymore, right?
Yeah.
Now we have all these problems, and I mean, we could go through tons of different scenarios where this was the case.
I had a conversation many years ago with a Protestant pastor. I will not mention the name of the church. And I mentioned to him, I said, Pastor, the church was, I asked it in the form of a question, as though, Alex Trebek. I said, Pastor, wasn't the church during the medieval ages the one that founded hospitals, that created the whole concept of hospitals? And therefore, if this is true, shouldn't we now be at the forefront of running hospitals and caring for the sick? And this Protestant pastor said, you're absolutely correct. And then I said, well, why can't we do this? And his answer, which I went away very sad, his answer was, well, we just don't do that.
Yeah, that's just not something we do, I guess. Well, who does it, though?
The secular world.
The secular, right, and that's, and maybe that's almost at the heart of this, where the secular world wanted to become the church, right? No, we're gonna not only care for the sick, but there will be no sick people. We're not only gonna make you happy, but there will be no unhappy people, right? And obviously this is very manifest in certain socialist political philosophies. But now we see the fruit of that, right? Well, they can't do it. Heck, as Christians, we weren't perfect at it either, right? Well, you can't make the world perfect.
Right.
I don't think we were trying to either.
Right, and so this cult of scientism, the way when it comes to medicine, psychology, and the hospital movement, the great problem we're seeing in it is not that there are human doctors that make mistakes. The problem is not that drugs have been overused and overdiagnosed for people. Those aren't the core problems that I see. The core problem that I see is the church stepped away from running the hospital. The Christians stepped away. There are Christian doctors, there's Christian nurses, but I view this as, no, actually the church, whether it's, if you're in a liturgical church, the bishops and priests, if you're in a more Protestant church where there's elders and deacons, whatever your church government is, the way I understood it historically, the historic church, the local churches ran those things. That way, the church could make decisions based on a Christian world view, not on a pagan worldview, not on a worldview that says there is no soul, not on a worldview that says there is no sin. When the church is involved in running the hospitals, when the church is involved in overseeing the doctors, then it seems as though you can root things in a biblical worldview. Now, this is probably really controversial, but it really isn't, because this is what the church did.
Well, so the one thing Catholics and Protestants historically agreed on was that St. Augustine was awesome, right?
Yeah, Dr. Sproul, who was in many ways a mentor to me theologically, you rarely could go a sermon listening to Dr. Sproul without hearing St. Augustine.
Yeah, so here's this one prolific Christian thinker we all honor. And what did he say? He says there's two cities, the city of God and the city of man. And now, of course, there's all this overlapping and they become entangled, and that's part of why we're asking questions, because we don't want the city of God, and to the extent that this is possible, to become the city of man. And it really seems to us like the city of man, apart from God, really wants to be the city of God. They want the heaven on earth. And so this thought, right, people who think we can have a heaven on earth, by our own devices, we should find that appalling as Christians, right? That's probably basically what we're saying is we are God when we think that way. So this is why we're trying to address these issues, because I feel, and it seems like you do too, Kenny, that there is too much mingling too much overlapping. And we're not even saying, well, no, we need a pure church. We're not saying we need to return to Puritanism. But this has to be a discussion. Otherwise, even if it's not the case now that the two are, commingled, it will become like that, to the point where you're like, well, where's the church? Well, it's right there. It's like, no, it's the world. No, that's the church, right? So I think that's why...
I don't think it's a coincidence that in this Corona era, I guess I'll call it the Corona era, that the churches are all closed, but the hospitals are open, the liquor stores are open, the abortion clinics are open. So the cult of scientism is open, for business.
Sure.
But the church is closed, and you can, I guess, watch them on live stream talk at you, but the vast majority of churches are closed for intimate, in-person spiritual counseling. They're closed for in-person one-on-one spiritual encouragement. People don't need liquor. Liquor is not the answer for corona. Abortions are not the answer for corona. And truth be told, the medicinal community, the hospitals, that's not the answer for corona. Because if it's your time to die, right? There's a time for each person appointed to die according to God, by God. Your soul needs to be right with God.
Mm-hmm.
You don't need to go see the doctor to save your soul. Now, the doctor can help look at you and help give you medical advice, he can give you physical solutions that may or may not work. But if you are sick to the point that you might die, you need to be with a pastor. You need to be with brothers and sisters in Christ who can pray with you and make sure your soul is right with God.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's the problem I see here.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's I think that's what's distressing, is everything you're saying that just sounds like the gospel. That just sounds like what a Christian would say, but I think it's kind of controversial. No, I think a lot of people would say, no, your first priority is to have a doctor get you better, to make you well. And it's like, well, yeah, we definitely, if you're sick, call a doctor, go to the hospital. There's definitely nothing wrong with that. But if you're a Christian and you really believe in the gospel, your first priority is to be right with God.
You see,
that precedes.
There's the key is that if you're not right with God, seeing the doctor could actually, I guess what am I looking for? It could make you forget
Mm-hmm.
that your soul is more important. So going to see a doctor is a good thing. Talking to a doctor is a good thing. Getting medical advice is a good thing. But if you're not intimately connected to the body of Christ, if you're not intimately connected with church leaders in a one-on-one, in-person way, you can easily forget that the most vital thing is not your physical body, it's your soul. I grew up Protestant, and what I'm saying in many ways comes from all of my Catholic readings from the medieval world. Because if you read the Catholic writers from the 11th, 12th, 13th century, 14th century, even in when I was working on my master's degree, we spent a lot of time studying Catholic writers from the 12th, 13th, and 14th century, and we were specifically at times studying the medical movement. And Catholic writers thought this way.
I mean,
what I'm saying is not controversial.
Oh, yeah, I mean, this is what Mother Teresa was criticized for when she would say stuff like, well, yeah, I'm here to help the sick and make them better and heal them, but the more important thing is to bring them Jesus.
That's right.
And this is what was his name? Hitchens, right? Christopher Hitchens. People, the atheist, would give her a lot of flack. And it's just like, well, I think that should very clearly show you the two positions, right? Here's a man who said that God is not great. That was the title of his book. And then here you have this little old nun who's actually in Calcutta, like on hand and knee, helping the sick people, but still saying, but yes, the most important thing is to bring them Jesus. Another example, John Paul II, they found a scourge in his room after he died. Well, what's the scourge for? So he could whip himself, right? So this is such a powerful impulse in the medieval church that it lasted all the way up to John Paul II, right? Where they would physically, and I'm not for this practice. I think most of you listening probably aren't, but it shows the attitude of the Christian towards their physical being, that it's like, well, there is a higher thing, right? And I think I guess that's what we're really trying to get across. There's just the higher thing. And psychology, and we all should agree on this, doesn't posit that higher thing.
Psychology, and I can speak as an authority who has graduated at the master's level and the undergraduate level with degrees at it, and it rejects this. It rejects the soul. It rejects sin, and that should make us weary and very, very hesitant to when psychology sends down its edicts on what is true and what is false. I'm very skeptical towards psychology, even though I actually still love psychology. I have a passion for psychology. It's been part of my studies since I was a kid. Nonetheless, my deeper passion is the glory of God. My deeper passion is coram Deo, to be before the face of God. And so psychology has to be subject to a biblical examination.
Yeah.
And that's what this discussion has been. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you did or didn't, send us your thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
You can attach it to any of the platforms we're on. You can listen to this on Google Podcasts. You can listen to this on Spotify. You can listen to this on iTunes. You can listen to this on Anchor. You can listen to this on Overcast. Please send it to your friends. We'd love to get the word out. We'd love to further this discussion. We really appreciate you listening to us. Until next time, the best is yet to come.